Thank you all for coming today. Can everyone hear me in this room?
Yes.
Hopefully at the other sites they're able to hear me as well. Thank you so much for that introduction. And I am completing my fellowship in neuropsychology here at the Cleveland Clinic. And I also have another specialty in health psychology. And that's really where I have my experience working with sleep and helping people develop healthier sleep habits. So thank you for allowing me to present today on sleep. I hope that it's an interesting presentation today, and I hope that you can take something away from it, very practical, that you can use in your everyday life to improve your sleep and your sleep habits. So I'll get this queued up. Excellent. Today I'd like to, first of all, start by talking about sleep itself. Before we talk about how to improve our sleep, I think it's important to have a foundation of understanding about what we're trying to improve or manipulate. And there are several factors that are involved with sleep, or I like to think of it in this way. There are physiological or biological processes that are happening before and during our sleep. But there are also behavioral and environmental factors that influence how well those are working. And then last but not least are cognitive and emotional factors. We like to think that our emotions don't interfere with our sleep quality, but it is in fact not true. So I'll talk about all of these different areas throughout my presentation today, and then we'll go back to it at the end of today's presentation to talk about how you can use this sort of diagram in your own life to identify if maybe physiological things are influencing your quality of sleep, if maybe environmental things might be interfering, or if there might be some emotional things that are influencing your quality of sleep. So we'll be coming back to this at the end, but kind of keep it in mind throughout the presentation. So I'd like to start today by talking about some of those biological processes. And the way that I like to think about this is that we have two systems in our body. We have an awake system, and we also have a sleep system. And I like to think about it as a little light switch for each of them. So we can have a light switch where our awake system is turned on, and this helps us feel very alert throughout the day. But we also have a sleep system, and when that light switch is turned on, then we get sleepy and we're tired. We want to fall asleep. And hopefully those two light switches work together. So when the sleep one is turned on, the awake one gets turned off, and vice versa. During the day, we hope that our sleep system is turned off so that we can be alert throughout the day. But sometimes those can get out of sync, and that can cause interference with our ability to fall asleep or stay asleep. Or it can also go awry during the day, and we can feel sleepy when we shouldn't be. But we see that looks like I've advanced. This is the one I meant to be on, sorry about that. So we're talking about the awake system, and that one helps you feel alert throughout the day. Let me make sure I didn't skip over anything on that first one. I was talking about the sleep and the wake system, and those are some of the activities that help us get prepared for sleep. Also, our internal clock helps prepare us for sleep. But then we'll also talk about some of the processes that happen during sleep as well. So I'll be tying in how those environmental and emotional factors influence it. So going back to what I was just talking about with the light switches of the wake system and the asleep system. Those work together in a 24-hour cycle. And how that cycle functions influences the intensity of our sleep. So if we get really good quality sleep, that means that both of those systems are working to their fullest potential, and that during the day we are as alert as possible, and at night we're getting the best quality sleep and the most restorative sleep as possible. For the awake system, we find that that system is the most activated for about 16 hours during the day. And if everything works nicely, it starts to get weaker as the sleep system becomes stronger. And then they sort of switch places with one another. And this sort of works to balance one another out. And our drive for sleep really depends on what we do during that awake time. If we're just passively lying around and we're not really taxing our body or causing it to exert ourselves, then we're not going to really have a need for that sleep system to be turned on. So during the wake system, we find that just normal everyday activity breaks down our body a little bit, and then that sleep system says, hey, I need to turn on in order to build and repair what's been sort of torn down during the day to help us recover. And there's a disturbance when that is out of balance. Maybe we're not exerting ourselves enough during the day, so then we don't really feel sleepy at night. Or maybe at night we're not getting good enough quality of sleep, so then during the day we're not able to participate in our normal activities and really earn that sleep at night. But we find that those two systems work best when we really earn our sleep during the day and exert ourselves physically, mentally, and sometimes emotionally as well. And then that sleep at night is really fully restorative. One of the ways that we manipulate this system, and we do that intentionally, is through the use of caffeine. As the wake system starts to get weaker throughout the day, we see that there is a naturally occurring chemical called adenosine that is produced in our body, and that turns on the sleep system. And how caffeine actually works is it blocks our body's absorption or use of adenosine. So it stops that sleep system from being turned on. So that's one way that we've kind of found to manipulate that system a little bit to our advantage. Another one of the biological processes that I think most people are familiar, at least with the term, is our circadian rhythm. And this influences more of our timing of sleep and a little bit less of the intensity or quality of our sleep. And we've got several brain structures that are involved, and also neurotransmitters or chemicals in our bodies, including hormones. The suprachiasmatic nucleus is found right in the center part of our brain. See if I can point it out for you here. It'd be right around there. And this is part of our hypothalamus, and that influences and controls all of our body's basic functions. Things like our appetite, our sleep, our alertness, as I mentioned before. It controls both that awake and that asleep system. It also controls things like our heart rate, our blood pressure, and our breathing. And we find that this is part of the interaction with the environment, that our environment actually cues different cycles of the hypothalamus and of that circadian rhythm. So without that feedback from our environment, that rhythm wouldn't be as adaptive for the environment that we're in. We might be in our sort of own 24-hour cycle, but it's really adaptive for us to be able to get that feedback from our environment so we can really be as productive as possible when we want to be. And specifically, our response to those environmental cues, we call those cues Zeitgebers. Zeitgebers are environmental cues that help set our biological clock, so they help us regulate it. If you've ever traveled to a different time zone, you notice that there's sort of a lag in your body's response to shifting to that new time zone. And that's because we need to give those Zeitgebers enough time to help reset our clock to that new time zone. And one of the most powerful ones of those is light itself. So one way, if you're traveling and you're in a new time zone, one way to quickly adjust to that is to expose yourself to light when you want to stay awake. And our bodies will naturally start to produce those awake chemicals to keep our awake system on when we are exposed to light. When that light starts to wax during the evening, a hormone called melatonin is produced. And this is on the bottom of the slide here. And that turns on the sleep system and helps us to get drowsy. Another way that people sort of help adjust to jet lag or a new time zone is by taking some synthetic melatonin, and that can help them adjust a little bit faster. Melatonin specifically is produced by the pineal gland, and that hormone is in our body at different levels throughout the day. So we find that at night, we have high levels of melatonin to help induce that sleep system, and then during the day, those levels go down in order to keep that awake system also as strong as possible. And this helps keep that sleep and wake cycle on track. Other possible environmental factors that can influence that circadian rhythm are temperature. As you think about a normal day, it's cooler in the morning and it gets progressively warmer throughout the day, and then it cools again at night. Our body actually sets itself to that change in temperature as well, and as it gets cooler at night, we start to get sleepier in response to that. Social interactions are another one that we respond to. Typically around dinner time, we visit with one another, and our body can actually start to respond to that and the habits that we develop around social interactions. So that might include things like meal times or just bedtime rituals that you have with children, those sorts of things. We also see that pharmacological or medication can influence this. Exercise is another important one that our body responds to. And just general eating and drinking patterns can start to be cues for our body. These cues are hopefully adaptive and help support that awake and that sleep system. But if these habits are unhealthy, they can also interfere with one another, and they can also cause dysregulation in that system. So that is part of what's going on in our body before we fall asleep. I think in general we think of sleep as a very passive activity, one of the simplest things that we do. We're able to just shut our brains off and not really participate. We're just passively experiencing it. But as you can see, that our body goes through a lot of complicated processes even before we start to think about sleep. There are a lot of cycles that are happening, and there's a rhythm that our body follows in order to help us prepare for sleep at night. And this activity doesn't really stop during the night either. We have found with research that there are very complicated processes that continue even during the night that help our biological functions sort of rebuild and recover. They help our mind consolidate memories and really improve other functions, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. So during sleep, typically our entire brain shuts down, but there are some interesting differences among mammals, and I thought it was fun that dolphins and whales don't experience sleep in the exact same way that we do. Only half of their brain sleeps at one time, and this allows them to keep one eye open in order to watch for predators, which I think is really cool. And it also allows them to surface and get air, otherwise they would drown during the night. So this is an exception to that rule, but for humans, our entire brain shuts down during the night or goes through these different stages of sleep. There are 3 non-REM stages of sleep, and REM stands for rapid eye movement. So there are sort of 3 stages that happen before that final stage, and those prepare our body for a deeper sort of sleep. The first stage is one that progresses from being fully awake and alert into a very light sort of sleep. And the second stage is our first stage of true sleep, where we have sort of an altered sense of consciousness. And then our third stage is our first true deep sleep. And then the rapid eye movement is our dreaming state, when our body is really in a deep stage of sleep, but our mind is still busy. In the first stage, we see that as our body prepares itself for those deeper stages, our body temperature drops, our muscles start to relax, and this is a time when our consciousness is starting to go into a deeper sense of relaxation, but we're still easily awoken up at this time. People have varied experiences at this stage. Some people have just a decreased sense of awareness of their surroundings. They might still hear noises or feel pets around, those sorts of things. And other people might not be aware at all during this stage. They might feel anywhere from drowsy to fully asleep. In the second stage, this is the first true sleep. Our eyes are very still during this stage, and our heart rate and our breathing start to slow down. It's that deeper sense of relaxation physiologically. And we see that there's some irregular brain activity at this time. It varies anywhere from very slow waves to little bursts of activity, or spindles are what they're called. And about half of our night is spent in this stage. We then go into the third or deep sleep stage, and this is the last one of our non-REM stages. At this time, our breathing becomes more regular, but our blood pressure and our pulse stay very low. And they're about 20 to 30% below our normal resting heart rate that we experience during the day. So it is a very sort of decreased level. And our brain at this level is less responsive to stimuli. So if you try to wake someone up, it would be harder to wake them up during this stage of sleep. We then go into REM sleep, and this is where we originally thought the only place that dreams happened, But we now know that there are dreams that happen at other stages as well, but this is when it's the most active. And we find that our brain is very active during this time, but our body is actually sort of paralyzed, and it doesn't respond to all of the activity that's going on in our brain, if everything is working correctly. Physiologically, our eyes actually dart around rapidly, and our body temperature, blood pressure, and breathing increase. They go back up to a closer to normal level for when we're awake. We go through this stage about 3 to 5 times a night. Every 90 minutes, we're sort of in this stage of sleep. The first cycle through is the shortest, and it gets progressively longer throughout the night. If we're deprived of this part of sleep, or if we're deprived of sleep in general, our body adapts, and it actually brings us to this more restorative stage of sleep faster, and we spend more time in it. So it's an interesting way of our body saying that this is the most important stage, we really need to get there. So if you find yourself after you've been awake for a few days, or you haven't gotten good sleep for a few nights, and you know that you just go straight into a deep stage, your body is just craving that sleep. That's what's happening. It's sort of a REM rebound. So just to quickly go back to show you this on the right side, this little figure shows some of the electrical patterns that just happen in those different stages. And that electrical pattern is our activity in our brain. So you can see how the level of activity varies throughout those different stages. Something that's interesting is that at any one of those stages, if you have interference, if someone wakes you up, or you're not able to easily progress to that next stage, it can interfere with your general quality of sleep. So we really want to get the best possible sleep in each one of those stages in order to have the most restorative sleep by the time you wake up in the morning. This figure just shows some of how that cycle goes around. We go from non-REM sleep into the delta stage, or the deep sleep, and then into the REM sleep. And that cycle kind of continues about every 90 minutes or so. And on the inside circle, I'm not sure if you can read it, it shows some of the physiological changes that go along with that, or what the body is doing at that time. And I'm going to talk about those here next. Something that's an interesting little fact, and I have these interspersed throughout my presentation, is alcohol's effect on sleep. And alcohol, as you probably know, is a depressant, so it slows down the function of the central nervous system. It helps bring that heart rate down, it helps relax your muscles, things that are very similar to some of those earlier stages of sleep. So it can actually help you initiate that sleep and feel sleepy. However, it then interferes with the quality of sleep in those later stages, in the deep sleep that's really restorative to the body. So it disrupts the REM sleep, and it also disrupts sleep in the second half of the night when we know that those REM cycles are longer. And it can also, because it really relaxes the muscles in the body, it'll over-relax some of the muscles in the throat, and that can make any kind of breathing problems that you have, snoring, etc., it can make those much worse, and that can interfere with quality of sleep as well. So generally, I tell people not to have alcohol for at least 2 hours before bed, so they're not sort of experiencing the negative effects of that. If you have, a glass of wine with dinner, it's not going to interfere in the same way. But if you have it right before you're trying to fall asleep, then it will. So we've talked about some of the biological processes that happen before sleep to prepare us for sleep, and then also during sleep. And I think it's really interesting to know what's happening in our body, or what the function of sleep is. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. In particular with biological processes, as you probably noticed with some of those cycles, things such as our blood pressure, our heart rate, our breathing, they really slow down. And these are things that we're using throughout the day that are supporting us. And we never really think about them. They're always, our blood is always being pumped, our heart is beating, and sleep allows a very unique time for those processes to slow down and recover when we're not moving about. So it's very important for those systems to really get the rest that they need in order to function as well as possible during the day when we really need them. So many of those processes slow down, our vascular system, our respiratory system, and then at certain stages our mental processes also slow down. Other processes, the more restorative ones, actually speed up during sleep. So things such as our metabolism, digestion, immune response, cell repair, and growth are actually, those activities are increased during the night. So we really do want to give our body time to repair those cells that we've been sort of tearing down a little bit during that wake system, and sleep allows us to do that. The pituitary gland is an interesting part of the sleep process, particularly for children. It releases a hormone that promotes muscle repair and also just tissue growth. So it's really important for children to get good quality of sleep because it helps them develop properly. Some of the cognitive functions of sleep include supporting our attention. So sleep allows the stimulus that goes into our brain, it gives us sort of a break from all of that activity. If you think about all of the activity that's going around us right now, we've got a lot of visual stimulation that's happening, a lot of auditory stimulation that's happening, a lot of sensory things that are happening, and our mind is constantly filtering those things out. At night, it gives us sort of a break from all of that stimulation. So it allows all of those cells to rest and recover, and that then helps support our attention throughout the day. It also supports our learning. If we've been practicing something, a motor activity, or just general, more verbal knowledge, our brain actually rehearses or replays that information during the nighttime, and that repetition helps us learn that information. It supports our memory by consolidating some of the connections between the neurons in our brain. Again, in the learning process, it sort of replays those connections, and by doing so, it strengthens those connections, and that's what's called consolidation. It helps our retrieval by weakening some of the connections between our neurons, or sort of downscaling them. So we don't want irrelevant information left in our brain, and sleep sort of helps clean out some of that garbage that we don't want left over from our day. It also supports other neural networks that are involved with judgment, with processing speed, and with reaction time as well. Things that we use throughout our day that I think a great example would be driving. We use judgment all the time in driving. We use processing speed to quickly sort of make decisions. And we also really want our reaction time to be functioning as well as possible. Sleep is really important as well for our emotional functioning. When we get good quality of sleep, it supports our emotional stability and well-being. We're less reactive to things. The opposite is also true. If there's a disturbance in our sleep, we have a greater sort of emotional reactivity. During sleep, some of the chemicals that are involved in our emotional regulation are balanced or brought to a stable level. So if we're not given that chance, then those might be dysregulated during the day, and that's part of why we're more reactive to things emotionally. I talked about how sleep gives our body time for certain systems to rest and recover. Another one of those systems is our stress response system, or our fight or flight response. Sleep is really a good time for us to feel safe and protected, so that system doesn't have to be constantly scanning our environment for potential threats. However, if this is chronically activated, so if someone has a lot of anxiety and that system is chronically activated, that's going to then interfere or creep into their sleep as well. So that can be something that's interfering. So there's definitely a reciprocal relationship between emotions. When we're more emotional, we tend to get less quality sleep, and unfortunately that less quality sleep then makes us more emotional. So it's a vicious cycle that gets started. That's what happens when sleep is functioning well. If we're deprived of sleep, some of the results are decreased performance, both physically and mentally. I mentioned that our reaction time decreases, our judgment decreases, and an interesting study showed that with 24 hours of sleep deprivation, it was comparable to a blood alcohol content of about 0.1%. So that's enough to get in trouble if you're pulled over driving in most states. I think that's a really interesting way of illustrating just how much that can interfere with our reaction time and our performance. When we're deprived of sleep, we have a certain response where our body wants to get that sleep, and we have little head nods, and I think we've all experienced those little head nods. And that's time of micro sleep, where our body is just really trying to get what it needs. And this is associated often with motor vehicle accidents, so it can be very dangerous to have those. It can be funny at other times, but we also see that if our immune system doesn't have that time to really take over and clean up our body, our immune functioning goes down as well. So we're more susceptible to infections or any kind of viruses, anything like that. There's quite a bit of research going on right now that shows that if we don't get good quality sleep, it actually changes the rate at which our brain ages. And there can be greater atrophy or shrinking of our brain tissue if we're not getting good quality sleep. There's an increased risk of high blood pressure, heart disease, diabetes, and as I mentioned, it also is associated with increased mental illness or emotional concerns. Weight gain is also another thing that happens when we're deprived of sleep. And part of how that works is when we have sleep loss, it actually changes the way our body metabolizes glucose. We are less efficient at metabolizing it. So that not only affects our physical body, but it also affects our brain functioning because our brain runs off of glucose as well. Because of that, our appetite increases and we want unhealthy food choices, things such as sugary foods or carbohydrates because we're sleepy and we want energy. By not sleeping the correct amount, we also have more time to just eat. So we're exposed to food and things in our environment more, so that just increases our chances for eating. And if we're sleepy, we're usually not being as physically active as we would be typically throughout that day. So we're actually not taking advantage of that wake system when it's turned on. We're sort of in a half sleep, half wake state. So that's how it can lead to some unfortunate weight gain. Another little interesting tidbit and sort of a function of sleep is dreams. And I wanted to just briefly touch on this, but I think dreams are interesting. And what's happening, or one theory of what dreams are, is that the brain is trying to make sense of just random electrical activity in our brain. About every 90 minutes, so kind of in sync with that cycle of the different stages of sleep, our brain stem sends random electrical impulses throughout the brain. And that's really the base part of our brain, sends those electrical signals out. And the outer parts of our brain are what we think about with more advanced sort of conceptual knowledge. So our prefrontal cortex or our frontal lobes, they try to make sense of that random activity that's being sent throughout the brain. And that's why we kind of make a story about it, or we fill in the gaps with it. We're trying to understand what that activity is. So there's no true meaning to that activity. It's very random, but it might tell you something interesting about yourself on the story that you make up in response to that random activity. So there's no true sort of function to it, but I think it's interesting. When sleep is not functioning well, or those systems, the wake system or the sleep system, get out of sync, there are several disorders that can ensue as a result of that. And one of the most common is insomnia. And this is defined as a difficulty initiating or maintaining sleep. And it could just be non-restorative sleep. So when you wake up in the morning, you're still tired, and that sleep system gets stuck on, perhaps. To be diagnosed with this, it has to persist for about 4 weeks. This can happen when the wake system is stuck on, or the sleep system doesn't adequately get turned on when you try to go to bed. It can also be involved with that overactivation of the stress system. If your body feels like there's a threat in the environment, it's not going to want to go into those deep stages of sleep where it would be more vulnerable. So it's going to try to stay in those lighter stages in order to protect itself. Something that would probably be very adaptive in our, in our history, but nowadays it's less adaptive for us. Insomnia can be primary, so it can be sort of the only difficulty and be in isolation, or it can be caused by several other conditions, such as anxiety, chronic pain, or medical concerns. This is one experimental treatment for insomnia that I found, and it reads, "Go to sleep, Gavin, or once again I'll have to knock 3 times and summon the floating head of death." But I think this would actually activate that stress system, so I don't think it would adequately work. Some disorders that we're finding out more and more about are breathing disorders and how those interfere with sleep. One is sleep apnea, and this is when someone has one or more pauses in breathing or shallow breaths during sleep. And this ultimately deprives your brain of oxygen throughout the night. If you think about how long you're in a sleep state, that's a long time to go without a full amount of oxygen that your brain really wants to recover. This can also activate that stress response in your body. If it feels like there's something that's sort of endangering it, that can be chronically activated. And it can reduce your getting to that deep and restorative stage of sleep as well. Snoring, a little bit more common, but also associated with sleep apnea, is actually when the airway muscles, or the muscles that surround the airway, relax and the surrounding tissue vibrates as a result of trying to breathe in. And there can be a number of different causes for this. It could just be due to swelling from sickness or allergies, or it could be from being overweight as well. It could just be from biological or structural abnormalities that you were born with as well, and those would be something that you might be able to have surgery for that would improve it. Hypersomnias, this is when there's excessive tiredness, or that sleep system gets stuck on. It doesn't ever get turned off during the daytime when you want to be awake. And this can be primary from central nervous system factors, such as neurodegenerative diseases, things such as Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, or multiple systems atrophy. It can also result from head injury, but often it's secondary, or it's the result of something else that's going on, such as mental health concerns. People can just want excessive amounts of sleep and just want to spend a lot of time in their bed when they're in a depressed state. Other medical conditions that are associated with excessive sleepiness are sleep apnea, which I just mentioned, MS, encephalitis, or obesity as well. Narcolepsy is a specific type of hypersomnia, and this is when the body is unable to control wakefulness and sleep. So those light switches get sort of turned on suddenly. The sleep one gets turned on suddenly during the day. And this is defined as excessive daytime sleepiness, and REM characteristics from that final stage of sleep that we talked about actually intrude into the day. So people can have loss of muscle tone, or all of a sudden just have their muscles go into an intense state of relaxation, which you can imagine would be unfortunate if you were standing up at the time. They also have vivid imagery, particularly when they are sort of coming out of their stages of sleep. And they could also have sleep paralysis, and this is when their body is still in that really relaxed state, but their mind is awake, and they sort of feel like they can't move. There are also movement disorders, and one that we often see in our patients here is REM sleep disorder. And that's when the normal muscle paralysis that happens during REM sleep to sort of disconnect the brain from the muscles, this doesn't occur, so people actually act out their dreams and all of that activity that's going on in their mind. So they'll shout, they'll punch, they'll thrash about in bed. And this can be quite dangerous for their bed partners. They can actually be injured in the process of this. For this one, the onset is typically after the age of 50, and about 70% of individuals develop Parkinson's, or it's associated with Parkinson's. Other types of movement disorders that can interfere with sleep are restless leg syndrome or periodic limb movement disorder. So there are a number of other things that can interfere with the quality of sleep. They can interfere with that wake system, or they can interfere with the sleep system. And these include chronic pain, diabetes, heartburn, nocturia, which is just the need to use the restroom frequently during the night. If that's waking you up, you're not going to get to those deeper stages of sleep. Or it could just be a medication side effect that you have insomnia, or your sleep is not as restorative as it could be. So after hopefully gaining a little bit better understanding about sleep, about the processes that go on before sleep and during sleep, I'd like to now focus on ways to really improve your sleep. So if you're having difficulties, how can we use that knowledge to then really target what's going on and make a change that's going to last? So one of the things that I've done with patients who are having sleep concerns is I have them keep a sleep diary. That's the first and foremost thing that I have them do. I think it's really important to understand your own personal health habits, and by doing so, or by tracking them, you really get a better understanding about what those actually look like. We all have misperceptions about our sleep. We think, oh, I get about 8 hours of sleep a night. When you actually write it down and look at the time that you go to bed, look at the time you fall asleep, look at the time you wake up, it's often quite different than what we think it is. So I have people just write down things such as what time they get into bed, what time they turn the lights off, what time they think they actually fell asleep, and then, when they first wake up, record the time that they wake up. Also, when they get out of bed, and other things that might be important. So if they exercise throughout the day, or if they had caffeine, those sorts of things might be important to track as well. Something that I personally do is I use a sleep app on my phone, and I actually put it on my bed at night, and it tracks the different stages of sleep that my body goes through. I think it's really interesting. I'm not sure how accurate it is, but it makes me think about my sleep, and it makes me think about the quality of sleep that I got at night. So I think that alone is useful. But it can also help me track how long I was in bed, and that's fairly accurate. And it will also provide you with things such as a white noise. In case your surroundings are very noisy, you can use a white noise in order to sort of cancel that out and have consistent noise help you get to sleep. Other things that you can do, once you use those sleep diaries to identify, okay, maybe I'm not going to bed at an early enough time, or maybe I'm going to bed and noise is waking me up, or maybe pain is waking me up. You can identify those different things that are triggering your sleep concern with a sleep diary. And once you do that, you can target those different things by just manipulating whatever you can. So it might be things in your environment that you change. I always recommend that people make their bedroom and the place that they sleep a sort of sanctuary. They keep it as calming as possible. They control the temperature of it and have it be very cool, because remember, that temperature, it will influence if your body goes through those cycles in really fluid ways, or it can interfere with your ability to go into those deeper stages as well. So you want the temperature to be controlled. You also want the light to be controlled. As I mentioned before, that light triggers the release of hormones to wake you up or to have you fall asleep. So if you have light creeping in, your body is going to respond to that. So you want it to be as dark as possible. You want to minimize noise if at all possible. And you want it to just be comfortable so your body can be in as relaxed of a state as possible. You want to avoid caffeine and alcohol and nicotine before bed, because our body is going to physiologically react to those things, even during our sleep when we're not aware of it. Something that I always share with patients is that caffeine actually has a second sort of kick in our system. When we first drink it, it blocks that adenosine that I talked about earlier, and it helps us feel more awake. It prevents us from feeling sleepy. But then there's another effect about 8 hours later, and our body can actually feel awake again 8 hours later. So I typically stop drinking caffeine at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, so it doesn't start to wake me up again at about 10. And everybody varies on their sensitivity to things like that, but it might be something to consider if you have several cups of coffee with dinner or something like that. In order to really take advantage of those Zeitgebers, exposing yourself to sunlight in the morning will help you really trigger that awake system. So one of the best things that you can do is go for a walk first thing in the morning, and that will help that wake system really be turned on in your body. And likewise, you want to minimize exposure to light just before bed. Because emotions can really interfere with our quality of sleep, you want to cope with stress as effectively as possible. Oftentimes people say that they lay down and their mind is still going with the day's activities, or things that they have to do the next day, maybe things they have to get at the grocery store, or things that they don't want to forget. And I always recommend to keep a journal next to the bed. And if you find yourself having sort of a busy mind as you're trying to fall asleep, take that journal and write down those thoughts, and then you can sort of close it up and remove those thoughts from your mind. You don't have to sort of carry those into sleep with you. If it's the grocery list for the next day, then you know that it's written down there and you're not going to forget it. You don't have to keep rehearsing that information in your mind. Exercise is also a really important thing that can really support our quality of sleep at night. It's one of the activities that we can do during that wake time of our day that can help us earn that sleep at night. So if we want to sort of cause good stress on our body, stress that's going to help our body want to restore itself later in the evening, exercise is one of the best things that we can do. Keeping a consistent sleep and wake schedule is very important because our body responds to habits. And as I have sort of reiterated throughout the presentation, is our body goes through all of these cycles that we're not aware of. And if we're constantly changing our habits, those cycles can get out of sync very easily. And the more consistent we are, the more consistent those cycles can be as well. And our bodies can become conditioned to the habits that we have. So our body can know that at a certain time, when we partake in a certain activity, it can act as a Zeitgeber and it can help us sort of initiate feeling sleepy. So we can use that to our advantage. Also, because of that, we want to keep our bedrooms only for sleep. Often when people have sleep problems, they spend a lot of time in bed thinking that that's just going to help them all of a sudden become sleepy, and then they'll be in bed and be able to fall right asleep. So they'll watch TV in bed, or they'll read in bed, or they'll do work in bed. And our bodies start to learn that bed is no longer just for sleep. It's for watching TV, it's for playing on the iPad, it's for doing all of these activities. So then it's confused when we get into bed on to whether or not we're actually going to sleep or whether we're going to partake in one of these activities. So keeping bed only for sleep, that's the best way to really teach your body to respond to that cue, and then when you get into bed, it knows what it's preparing itself for. You can also sort of take advantage of that conditioning by developing a sleep routine. Things such as brushing your teeth or reading quickly before bed, having a cup of tea. All of those things can start to cue your body to start to be sleepy or release all of those chemicals that induce sleep. So it can help you get into those lighter stages of sleep earlier when you do finally get into bed and shut those lights off. As I mentioned before, exposing yourself to that light during the day helps you feel awake, so then minimizing that exposure to light right before bed. And one of the worst ways that we can expose ourselves to light is with television, because we get a lot of flashing lights and a lot of movement, and that really messes with our body's sleep system and it confuses it. So I always tell people, don't watch TV for about an hour before bed if you can. And also to avoid any kind of bright screens. If you are using a screen to read on right before bed, dim it as much as possible. And also avoid passive stimulation, because this can keep your body awake without you having to do anything to exert itself. So you can stay in a sleepy state, you can be really tired, but you won't realize it because you're just passively being entertained by something. So do something if you are sleepy that takes a little bit of effort, like reading a book, because then you're going to notice when your body actually says, it's ready, it's time for bed, I want to fall asleep. So avoid that passive stimulation. If those sort of little manipulations don't help improve your sleep, there are a lot of treatments that can help your sleep. And some of these are ways of just dealing with those secondary concerns. So dealing with emotions better, or dealing with stress better, or learning about how your thinking also influences sleep and those other systems. So mindfulness meditation is one that I often recommend, and that helps individuals be able to control their body going into that lighter stage of sleep a little bit. So that lighter stage of sleep is the transition from feeling fully awake to feeling drowsy to going then into our first stage of true sleep. So if we learn to control our alertness and our attention and bring our body into a deeper state of relaxation but with meditation, that can help us sort of prepare ourselves for bed, and it's an excellent sleep routine that you can start to develop. Something that I recommend for people to do is to listen to a guided meditation, because then it's not very effortful. It can really allow them to get into a deeper stage of sleep. Cognitive behavioral therapy is what I've used when I've treated people's sleep concerns, and this allows you to identify if there are any thought patterns that you might have developed, or if there are any behavioral patterns that you might have developed that might be interfering with your sleep. These can be things such as being quite anxious about not getting good quality of sleep, ironically. If you're laying in bed and you're not able to fall asleep, that can bring a state of anxiety because you start to worry about, I'm not going to be able to function tomorrow at work, or I'm not going to be able to do this if I don't start to fall asleep. And your thoughts can actually maintain that cycle. And cognitive behavioral therapy would target things such as that and really identify if those thoughts are interfering with your ability to fall asleep. Behaviorally, it would identify negative patterns that you have, such as if you have a habit of turning on the TV at 11 o'clock at night and then you don't fall to bed until midnight or so, that would be a behavior that would interfere with your body's natural sleep system. And then you could target that in therapy. In cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the things that we do is we try to actually restrict people's sleep or make it as efficient as possible. So we want the time that you spend in bed to be as filled with good quality sleep as possible. So we want to reduce the amount of time that you lay in bed preparing for sleep. And we also want to reduce the amount of time at the other end when you wake up in the morning and you're sort of trying to get yourself alert. So I always recommend for people that if they're in bed for over 20 minutes and they're not falling asleep, to start to get up and do something. Because again, otherwise your body's going to learn that my bed is for just lying here and mulling over the day or doing whatever activity you might be doing. So if sleep doesn't come right away, go and do a quiet activity so your body can actually feel tired when you are in bed. And then when you wake up in the morning, get out of bed and again, go expose yourself to light to really wake up your body. Go for a walk. Exercise can be a great way of really activating that wake system in your body. And you find that then your body learns that the bed is for sleep, and then that time in bed is as efficient as possible. Another way of improving our sleep, or an intervention that's often used, is medication. And this is one that can be helpful, but is typically best used for the short term because people can often develop habits around medication. And the longer that you use it, it's often less effective. So then you also have to increase the dosage of it. But I think personally, the thing that I dislike the most about it is it never really changes the reason why someone's having sleep problems, So when they go off the medication, those bad habits or whatever might be going on, they're still present and they're still going to have difficulties falling asleep. So I think it's much more effective to really identify what those contributing factors are and try to make changes in those areas first. Every once in a while, or sometimes medications are, really necessary, but if at all possible, doing behavioral interventions first is ideal. So as I mentioned, we can have sort of difficulties in each one of these different areas. We can have physiological or biological factors that are influencing our sleep. We can have behavioral and environmental factors. And we can also have cognitive and emotional factors. And those all work together in order to influence our sleep quality. Those can work together in a positive way if we have healthy habits, if we are exercising, eating right, avoiding, the nicotine, the caffeine right before bed. That can help support our physiological processes. If we have our environment be as supportive as possible, that can help support our sleep as well. And if we're dealing with stress effectively, managing our emotions effectively, that can also help that entire system be as healthy and functioning as well as possible. So at this point, I'd like to open it up for questions. If anybody has any. Yes?
What would you consider a typical good night's sleep for Mr. and Mrs. typical senior citizen?
The question was what a typical good night's sleep is for a senior citizen. And that's a great question. And we do know that sleep varies with age and over someone's lifetime. So expecting to get the same kind of sleep that you got when you were a teenager is not going to be practical. But I think if you feel like you have good and restorative sleep, if you wake up in the morning and you're feeling refreshed, that's a sign that that's good quality sleep at night. The amount of time can vary from person to person. It's typically recommended to get 8 hours of sleep and that's where I usually start with individuals. But if you feel like 6 hours of sleep is what you need and you're able to function well off of it, then that might be what your body needs as well. So you can answer that question in sort of a timeline and also with quality of sleep. So I think that really finding what works best for each individual is ideal, but aiming for 8 hours is always a good thing as well.
Good
Yes?
question.
Mm-hmm.
If your sleep gets interrupted, say in stage N3,
Mm-hmm.
something happens, boom, you have to be awake. Does the process start all over again? N1, N2, N3, I mean, do you have to run through that cycle again?
It depends. Sometimes it can, and that can be really frustrating if someone, so sorry, the question again is, if you get woken up in one of the deeper stages of sleep, so for example in a non-REM stage 3, do you have to go back through that entire cycle to get back to where you were at that moment, or do you just go back into that stage? And some people are able to quickly fall back asleep. I think it depends on the reason why you were woken up. If it's something that activated your stress response, you'll probably be more alert and more awake, and you might have to go back through all of those different stages. So if it really woke you up truly, then you might have to. If it was just sort of a light disruption, you might go back to that stage easier. But it can be very frustrating for people sometimes when they are woken up. One of the reasons why I use the sleep app that I do is it actually senses which stage of sleep that you're in, and you can have the alarm clock wake you up in a lighter stage of sleep or in a stage of sleep where you'll feel most alert. Because sometimes even our alarm clocks just wake us up at a random time, and we don't know what stage of sleep we'll be in at that time. So sometimes we feel alert and it's at a good stage of sleep. Other times we still feel groggy, and it might be that we were in a very deep stage of sleep when we were woken up. So I think that's an interesting function of that app, that it sort of tracks that and allows you to wake up at the most optimal time. Yes?
I think there's been a recent study released about benzodiazepines increasing Alzheimer's by 51%. Sleep medications, I know they're not a benzodiazepine. Does it fall into that same category, and what are the risks of those?
I personally, so the question was on medications, in particular with benzodiazepines, and how those increase Alzheimer's. Is that what you were saying as well? Yes. I don't personally prescribe medications, so I would not be the best person to ask for that. I do know that they are often prescribed for some of those secondary reasons why a person might not be sleeping. Perhaps emotional concerns are keeping them from sleeping, so if they sort of target that with medication, then the sleep is going to improve. So it might be sort of used in that way for sleep concerns. But yeah, I can't speak directly to how that would influence it. How about in the front, and then we'll go to the back.
So what do you prescribe, if you don't prescribe medications? Because I take trazodone, clozapam, Ambien, and melatonin. So if you don't prescribe medications, then what do you prescribe?
So the question is, if I don't prescribe medications, what do I prescribe?
Exactly.
And as a psychologist, that's the reason why I don't prescribe, is because I approach concerns from a behavioral way. So I prescribe behavioral interventions. I help individuals track their sleep, as I was mentioning, and really identify where it might be breaking down. And then I might prescribe them to change that behavior or change that habit. And so, medications are often managed with your MD, with whoever might be prescribing that. And it can be effective to do both of those sometimes. Maybe you're on the medication and you want to reduce that medication. It can be most beneficial to sort of bring positive habits along with that reduction in medication, so you're not just cutting it out cold turkey. So combining those sorts of treatments can often be very helpful.
Right. Well, she's had me do some of the things that you spoke of, that as well.
One of the things, if those haven't been helpful, doing a formal therapy, such as cognitive behavioral therapy, might really help you commit to a treatment program for understanding your sleep, for getting a better idea of what might be going on. And actually at our website, Keep Memory Alive, there's an online sleep program, and it's a cognitive behavioral program. I haven't personally looked at it, but from what I've read about it, it seems like it would be a really good program. So that's something that you can take a look at if you're interested.
Thank you.
Natasha, can you see if Elko has a question before we take your last question here?
Sure.
One of your suggestions was mindful meditation, and they had suggested that you could listen to a tape or anything, instead of trying to do it on your own. Do you
Sure.
recommend any kind of tape for that?
Thank you for the question. And do I have to repeat it if it's from them? It's just on a recommendation for mindfulness meditation, and what I typically recommend for people is to just search for it online and download it or stream it. If you wanted to also purchase it in a store, if you looked, you could also find CDs that had them. I typically don't make specific recommendations because I think people respond to each meditation differently. The voice can be really soothing to one person, but kind of annoying to another person, and the way that they go through it might be kind of touchy-feely for one person, or it might be a little too straightforward. So I always recommend just trying out a number of different ones and see what you think is best. And the last question in the back.
Is taking the occasional nap upset that sleep cycle?
That's a great question. Does taking the occasional nap disrupt that sleep cycle? And I would say that an occasional nap probably won't, but it does depend on how long that nap is, and also it depends on when that nap is. If you're taking it just after dinner time, it might then interfere with your ability to fall asleep when you want to, and it might sort of shift that cycle back a little bit, which is not ideal. So an occasional nap, as long as you keep it rather short so you're not getting into those later stages, that's helpful as well. And making sure that it's not, a consistent habit, because that's a sign that you're not getting as restorative of sleep as possible during the night. So I would start by trying to improve the quality of sleep rather than supplementing it with naps.